that I love very much, a city where I lived for about a year in 2002, 2003, and then I returned to in 2008. And so I will share with you some thoughts about this city as a Jewish city, its Jewish past. And I'm going to share a screen. Hopefully I can, yes, I think you can all see. So let me begin. Let me begin by saying that upon returning to Minsk at the end of World War II, Hersh Smolyar, who was a Polish Jew who had moved to Soviet Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, described the destroyed city. He walked through its streets in search of the buildings he had once known. He had lived in Minsk for several years before the war and had been active in the city's Soviet Yiddish institutions. He looked for the Writers' Union building on Freedom Square in vain, as most of the city had been obliterated by the bombs that the Germans launched during their offensive in July of 1941. 60 years later, more or less, during the 10 months I spent in Minsk to conduct the research on which my book is based, I also walked through the streets of the city in search of the places I had seen in pre-war photographs and postcards, or had so vividly imagined after reading about them. But most of these places that appear in my book remained only in my imagination. The physical annihilation at the hands of the Nazis, of Minsk Jewry, killed within the boundaries of the city itself, on the very site of the Minsk ghetto, produced an irreparable loss. During World War II, the bombardment of the city and the destruction of its streets, houses, Jewish quarter, institutions, synagogues, further obliterated the memory of this community. Unlike cities like Vilnius or Vilna, or Grodno, Horodno, where the physical annihilation of the Jews was at least mediated by the preservation of most of their Jewish historic urban spaces, Minsk was razed to the ground. The memory of Jewish Minsk was once again destroyed with the emergence in the post-war years of state-directed anti-Semitism under the Soviets, which precluded the historical research on and the preservation of material about Jewish topics. During our brief time together this evening for you, late morning for me, I would like to take you on a journey through the Jewish city of Minsk in an attempt to recreate some of the special traits of this community and the geography of the city in which it once lived. During this journey, I will be focusing primarily on the interwar period from World War I until the beginning of World War II. I will do so not only because most of the defining traits that allow us to classify Minsk as a Jewish city will have disappeared by the end of World War II, but I will do so also because this period is less known to scholars, specialists of Eastern European Jewish history, culture, and life. This period coincides with the first 2 decades of the implementation of the Bolshevik experiment, during which the new regime, the Soviet regime, carried out the Sovietization of the Jewish population. So let me just remind you how little we know about Soviet Jewry, and Minsk Jews fell under this category. Perhaps the most understudied Jewish community in Eastern Europe, especially how little we know about those Jews who lived in the territory of the former Pale of Settlement, I'm just showing you here an image, that came under Soviet rule. Historians have focused primarily on the Jews of Moscow and Leningrad, where the elites lived and where a large percentage of Jews moved to during the 1920s and 1930s, but most Jews remained in the territory of the former Pale of Settlement. The problem is that these communities were completely wiped out by the Nazi invasion of 1941. And the few survivors of these communities usually did not return to their destroyed hometown like Minsk, but moved elsewhere after the war. So historians have tended to project or superimpose the post-World War II reality of the Jews in Moscow and Leningrad, very assimilated, and their specific path to acculturation and assimilation onto the lives of those Jews who had lived in the former Pale of Settlement before the war and who had experienced Sovietization in a very different way. So let's begin this journey. The publicist and traveler Shpilevsky, who wrote extensively for the publication Современник, The Contemporary, one of Russia's 19th century main periodicals, published a series of monographs on the cities of the northwestern provinces of the Russian Empire. About Minsk, which had become a provincial capital of the Russian Empire during the late 18th century, Shpilevsky wrote, "Minsk is one of the biggest and most beautiful cities of Western Russia. Thanks to the commodities and the reconstruction conducted after the fire of 1835, Minsk can be considered the capital of Belarusia. It is bigger and more stylish than Mohilev and Vitebsk." Shpilevsky reluctantly pointed out the Jewishness of the city, with a hint of anti-Jewish prejudice, typical of 19th century Russian conservatives. He described the low market, also known as the Old City. This was the Jewish quarter, dominated by what he called the Jewish square, its small businesses, and on the Sabbath, the distinctive smells of the meals cooked for the holy day. The high market was also overwhelmingly Jewish. It was the residence of wealthier Jewish merchants who traded in clothing and silk, and was the site of the first Jewish state school established in the city. With its inauguration in 1845, in the same building that for years had housed the Talmud Torah, the Jewish institution that helped orphans, Jewish orphans, Minsk became one of the most prominent Haskalah centers, or centers of Jewish enlightenment, in the northwestern provinces of the Russian Empire. Although the publicist Shpilevsky did not refer explicitly to Minsk as a Jewish city, the reader of this essay is left with the impression of a city inhabited primarily by Jews. Indeed, the demographic nature of the city contributed to the perception of Minsk as a Jewish city. According to the 1897 census, more than 52% of the total population of Minsk, 52% was Jewish, making it the fourth largest Jewish community in the Pale of Settlement. In the words of Professor Saul Lieberman, who was a distinguished Talmudic scholar and who was born near Pinsk in 1898, and who arrived in Minsk following the beginning of World War I, Minsk made an impression on me as a large city where everyone was Jewish. I had not yet seen such a Jewish city, he says. Liberman recalled a hot summer day in 1915 when he was strolling through the old city that Szpilewski just described for us on a narrow street known in Yiddish as zwischen die Kromen, or amongst the shops, with his elderly uncle, who was a rabbi from Lohoysk, a shtetl outside of Minsk. And because of the heat and the few customers, the shopkeepers were sitting outside their stores. As his uncle approached the shops one by one, the shopkeepers began to stand up, and out of respect for the rabbi, they formed around him a long line as if they were soldiers, he writes. I had never seen a similar thing happen elsewhere. This was a rabbi whom they did not know, but recognizing him as such because of his clothing and appearance, they remained standing until he crossed the street. Most of the Jewish traits of Minsk were preserved until World War II. The demographic nature of the city remained more or less unaltered throughout the 1920s and 1930s. 43% Belarusians lived in Minsk, 41% of the population was Jewish, and about 10% were Russians and 6% Polish. The number of Jews was roughly equivalent to that of Belarusians, the largest nationality in the city. In particular, the neighborhood in which Jews had settled in the early 18th century remained largely unchanged well into the 1930s. Jewish Street, Еврейская улица, Governor Street, улица Губернаторская, and Rakovskaya Street, улица Rakovskaya, were all situated in the city section that Szpilewski had called Low Market or Old Street, an area that was also known as Nemiga or Nyamiga, and were still inhabited primarily by Jews. In his autobiographical short stories, the writer Arkady Kapilov, and I'm showing you here the book that maybe some of you know, he describes Zamkovaya Street, Ulica Zamkovaya, where numerous Jewish institutions had been established during the 18th and 19th century as an overwhelmingly Jewish neighborhood on the eve of World War II. Here, by the way, at the very end of this street, you see the cupola. This is you can see the synagogue at the very end of this street, which was destroyed during World War II. The degree of continuity in Jewish ethnic quarters preserved in the urban geography of the city leaps to the eye when we look at a map of Jewish Minsk from before the revolution of 1917, and we compare it with one from the late 1920s. The preservation of Jewish urban spaces in Minsk was the outcome of a residential segregation that easily lasted throughout the 1920s and 1930s due to the city's provincial character. In larger metropolitan centers like Leningrad, Moscow, or Kyiv, residential segregation was usually disrupted in the early and mid-1920s. The Jews of Minsk were part of the historical territory of Lita. Lita, if I go back to my map, includes Belarus, what is today Belarus, Belarusia, and Lithuania. This was known as Lita or Lite by Jews. Lite is Lithuania in Yiddish. And Minsk shared the same cultural identity of Lithuanian Jewry, and their capital, Vilnius, or as they called it, Vilna, or Vilne, located in the heart of the Pale of Settlement. As you can see, Vilna is right here at the top. I don't know if you can see, but you're familiar with the geography, I'm sure. Minsk and Vilna. Minsk is about 160 kilometers southwest of Vilna. And in his memoirs, Danil Charny, who was the brother of the distinguished literary critic Shmuel Niger, mentioned a Yiddish popular expression that captures well the close, but at the same time hierarchical relationship existing between these two Jewish cities. The expression Minsk and Vilna via Stub mitakamer means Minsk and Vilna like a house with a chamber, the house being Vilna and the chamber being Minsk, symbolized in a way the supremacy of Vilna over Minsk, but also the interdependence, the intimacy, the familiarity between these two historic Jewish centers. As Vilna, Minsk also developed in the Litvish or Lithuanian tradition, favoring the analytical and rationalist interpretation of Jewish texts, Jewish tradition, Jewish lore, over the mystical one endorsed by Hasidism, by Hasidic rebbes, generally more rooted in the southern provinces of what was the Russian Empire in the Ukrainian lands. In the course of the 17th and 18th century, the city turned into a well-known center for Jewish religious scholarship, competing in fame with other major Torah centers in Eastern Europe. At the end of the 19th century, the famous rabbi Yeroham Yehuda Leib Perelman, who was also known as der Minsker Godel, or the great scholar of Minsk, served as a rabbi in the so-called Blumkes Klois, one of the largest yeshivas, or yeshivas, the Jewish institution that ordains rabbis, one of the largest yeshivas in Minsk at the time. There were 99 synagogues that existed in Minsk at the end of the 19th century, 99, and only 3 were Hasidic. Minsk developed in the same cultural tradition as Vilna, not only in its approach to religious scholarship. The success of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and of socialist-oriented movements was also a specific trait of the Lithuanian region of Lita, which means Belarus and Lithuania. Well, a large segment of Minsk Jews joined the Zionist movement, and I'm showing you here an image from the second conference of Russian Zionists that was held in 1902 in Minsk with 526 participants. It was the Bund that captured the political support of most Jews, the Jewish socialist movement established in Minsk in 1897. At the end of the 19th century, Minsk became one of the largest centers of Jewish socialism, Bundism, and labor Zionism alike, throughout the territory of what was then the Russian Empire. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Minsk became the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is not a great map, and I apologize because you can see independent Poland, but you don't really see the borders of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, but I'm sure that most people are very familiar with them. The Jews were granted after 1917, for the first time, political freedoms, civil rights, and unprecedented upward mobility. At the same time, the Minsk Jewish community was destroyed. And by early 1921, all Jewish parties, Jewish political parties, with the exception of labor Zionism, the Poalei Zion, which continued to exist until 1928, all the Jewish parties were dismantled. But the Bundist tradition of Minsk, in a way, carried on well into the late 1920s, as most of the city's new Jewish political leadership was made up of former Bundists who had joined the Communist Party after 1921 and who became part of the so-called Yevsektia, or the Jewish section of the Communist Party that was established by the Bolsheviks to bring communism to the Jewish masses. As former Bundists became members of the Yevsektia, they attempted to balance their communist ideas with their pre-revolutionary political identity and cultural heritage, often giving expression to the Bundist legacy in their political strategies, institutions, and cultural discourses of the day. Let me just mention one example to you. Hirsch Leckert, who was a legendary Bundist fighter from Vilna, from Vilnius, who in 1902 had attempted to the life of Vilna Governor General Victor von Wahl, was turned by the Jewish political elite into a hero, a communist hero, a Jewish communist hero. In the summer of 1922, a monument to immortalize the memory of Leckert was erected in Freedom Square. This is Freedom Square. And it replaced, and I'm showing you here the monument, it replaced the monument to Tsar Alexander II. So instead of Tsar Alexander II, the monument of Hirsch Leckert with the writing in Hebrew characters that you see here was, replaced the monument to Alexander II. You also have streets and institutions throughout the city that are renamed after Hirsch Leckert. Drawing on the political and cultural usable past of the region, the Jewish leaders of Minsk rescued the pre-revolutionary Bundist hero and Sovietized him. In line with official ideology, the Yevsektia systematically persecuted Jewish religion, Zionist groups, closing down synagogues, and organizing trials against local rabbis and teachers of Jewish elementary schools. But Jewish life in this historic Jewish center did not change radically overnight in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, as even some of the most devoted communists maintained a Jewish identity, maintained an allegiance to specific features of a Jewish self-identification. In terms of religious practice, for example, kosher meat could be easily purchased in Minsk until the early 1930s. In spite of the Yevsektia's constant attack on ritual slaughtering, the slaughtering according to Jewish law in the city, the production of kosher meat in Minsk continued to thrive. By early 1928, most beef cattle in the city were slaughtered according to the ritual laws of kashrut, the Jewish law. The meat distributed in the main food cooperatives of the city had been slaughtered according to the Jewish method. So much so that when a housewife planned to purchase non-kosher meat, she had to go to one of the city's food cooperatives, approach the shop's counter, and specifically ask the store clerk for non-kosher meat. The number of cattle killed with the Jewish method exceeded the demand for kosher meat because of the specific dietary restrictions connected to kosher slaughtering. However, it was the historic Jewishness of the city and the number of those, the so-called shochtim, those who knew how to slaughter the cattle based on Jewish method, and the viability of kosher slaughtering under the Soviets in the 1920s that remained accountable for the large amount of cattle slaughtered according to the Jewish ritual. What about Jewish religious education? Well, the decree of June 1922 sanctioned the closing down of all existing Jewish religious institutions like, the yeshivas and the cheder, the Jewish traditional elementary school throughout Belarusia. And this represented a blow to Jewish religious education. It did not put an end to it. Under the leadership of Rabbi Yehoshua Cymbalist, who was also known as Rabbi Horodner because he was born in Grodno and moved to Minsk during World War I, Jewish religious education underwent a substantial resurgence, but it was underground. In 1924, Rabbi Cymbalist established an underground yeshiva. Again, the Jewish institutions where rabbis are trained, and he established it in the synagogue that I showed you. In Nemiga, you could see the top of the synagogue. He established it there with 70 students. The Minsk yeshiva that operated underground was the largest one in the Soviet Union. It attracted students from throughout the Soviet territory, but even from Poland. People from Poland religious Jews crossed the border and moved to Minsk. There were 400 young Jewish students who studied in underground religious institutions in 1926 and more than 320 in 1929. In commenting about the existing religious education infrastructure, Moshe Tzvi Neriach, who also became a rabbi, observed, quote, rabbis from other cities in Russia or the Soviet Union would come to Minsk and be surprised by what they saw. Something of this nature in a time like this, how is it possible? They never imagined that there was still such a place. After all, such activity is connected to the dangers of arrest and deportation under the Soviets. And what about the practice of circumcision? Surprisingly, during the 1920s and 1930s, circumcising one's son was the norm among Soviet Jews, not the exception, even among Jewish communists. While Jewish communists rarely married with a religious ceremony, rarely, if ever, attended synagogue or performed the Sabbath ritual of candle lighting, many of them were still committed to the tradition of circumcision. As one member of the Communist Party commented in 1927, the performance of circumcision among workers who are members of the Communist Party and are employed in the factories of the city of Minsk is so widespread that it has assumed a chronic character. It has become an epidemic. As many of you know, Yiddish language had been identified by the Soviet authorities as the national language of the Jewish national minority group as early as 1919. Not only because it was spoken by the large majority of Jews and therefore could be used as the language of propaganda to bring communism to the Jewish masses, but also because Hebrew was associated automatically with Zionism and the Jewish religious tradition, and consequently was deemed illegal. In Belarusia, only in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, there was official support for Yiddish that was enshrined in law by the Belarusian constitution, so that together with Belarusian, Polish, and Russian, Yiddish was one of the 4 official state languages of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. The official status of Yiddish entailed government support for cultural institutions and political agencies operating in Yiddish, Communist Party institutions, as well as academic institutions, and an impressive network of kindergartens, primary and secondary schools established in the city, operated in Yiddish. What did the official status of a Jewish language in a Soviet city look like? So let me give you some examples. First of all, I'm showing you the Minsk Central train station. The name of the city appeared not only in the 3 Slavic languages, Belarusian, Russian, and Polish, but also in Yiddish on the right-hand side. Passengers who traveled to the city and saw the Hebrew letters on the building were reminded of the official status of the language. A number of important institutions in the city displayed the official name on their building in Belarusian and Yiddish. In this photo, you see a plaque with the name of the main institution of higher learning in the city, BGU, Belarusian State University, with its name that appears in Yiddish and in Belarusian, in parentheses. Can you imagine that being the case today? In this other photo, you see the building of what used to be the synagogue and was turned into the Belarusian Yiddish State Theater. You can see it in its, I hope you can see the Yiddish letters. This became the main Yiddish culture institution in the city, and its name appears not only in Yiddish, but also in Belarusian. This is a photograph of the inside, the interior of the Belarusian Yiddish State Theater. Here you have also the Universalny Magazine, the store, the supermarket, and here too you see the 4 languages, including Yiddish. And here also you see young Jewish students in a Yiddish language middle school who in 1927 participate in the parade to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the revolution, and they're marching on the streets of the city carrying flags in Yiddish. Minsk also became perhaps the only large city in Eastern Europe where it was possible to see in the late 1930s a truck traveling through the streets of the city and distributing bread to local stores. And the truck had, the writing of bread on it was in Yiddish, and Yiddish only. The language was heard on the Belarusian state radio, which throughout the 1920s and 1930s broadcast programs in Yiddish at specific times of the day, Yiddish radio programs that were aired in Minsk from mid-1936 to 1938, including a radio broadcast of a Sholem Aleichem, the Yiddish writer, evening dedicated to the 20th anniversary of his death, with readings by Minsk Yiddish writers and actors of the Belarusian state, the Belarusian Yiddish State Theater. Something that was not possible in other Eastern European cities like Warsaw. There was no radio program in Yiddish in Warsaw, in Vilna, or in Łódź and other cities. And even in Kiev, it wasn't that easy. So let me read to you. Here you have another image of a Yiddish Soviet Jewish school in Yiddish. a scientific subject that is being taught in Yiddish, as you can see from the blackboard. So I want to read to you a quote from a Yiddish writer, Yud Zinger. Some of you might know him, the brother of the well-known Bashevi Zinger, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Yud Zinger wrote about some, what he noticed when he visited Minsk in 1928, and he compared the role of Yiddish in the life of Moscow, to the role of Yiddish in Minsk. More than in Moscow, he wrote, Jewish life makes sense and has a substance in Minsk. Of course, Moscow has many more Jews than Minsk. Moscow has a Yiddish theater, publishing houses, clubs, a Jewish faculty, courses, and the Jewish leaders and Yiddish writers are in Moscow. But against the backdrop of stony, true Russian, church-filled Moscow, Jewish life appears like a strange blemish, a bit of nonsense. In Minsk, the Yiddish signs, the schools, the courses, the theater, the newspaper, the courtroom, the scholarly institution, are something natural. It was unnatural that they did not exist before the revolution. The official status of the language and the state's support for Yiddish cultural, educational, and scholarly enterprises turned Minsk into the Eastern European capital of Yiddish, or at least many Soviet Jews believe so. This standing lasted 18 years, from 1920 until July 1938, when the Supreme Soviet of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic decided to terminate the official status of Yiddish as a state language and to liquidate most Yiddish institutions in the city. This coincided with the terror campaign unleashed by Stalin on Soviet society from 1936 until 1939. The purging of the Yiddish street began in mid-1937, when the leaders of the most prominent Yiddish institutions in Minsk underwent systematic criticism in the pages of the local press. By the end of the summer of 1937, the director and founder of the Belarusian State Yiddish Theater, Rafalski, was arrested. Here I'm showing you Yiddish writers Moshe Kulbak and Izi Harik are also arrested and accused of Jewish nationalism. Soviet Yiddish culture, in one of the most important centers for Yiddish culture and scholarship in the Soviet Union, was affected by these purges, and for all intents and purposes came to an end, with the exception of the Yiddish newspaper Oktyaber, or October. Most Yiddish institutions were closed down, together, by the way, with the Polish institutions in the city. When the Germans occupied the city on June 28, 1941, the Jewish population reached 100,000, due to the thousands of Jewish refugees coming from cities like Bialystok, also from the Third Reich, from Austria, and other areas. Established in July 1941, and I'm showing you here images of young Jews who were forced into the ghetto in Minsk. And here it's mostly Jewish women under the supervision of Germans and their collaborators. Established in July 1941 at the outskirts of the city, close to the Jewish cemetery, the Minsk ghetto stands alone in the history of the destruction of Eastern European Jewry. The majority of the ghetto population was killed during the Aktionen carried out by the Germans and their collaborators from November 1941 until July 1942. In 1941, a group of Jews, some of them, one of them I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, was Hersh Smolyar, the Polish Jew who had moved to Minsk and who, described the city after it was destroyed, they organized a resistance movement in the ghetto. Through its links to its Belarusian counterpart outside the ghetto, the resistance organized acts of sabotage and working together with the Jewish council, the Judenrat, inside the ghetto. It diverted the production from the workshops and factories of the ghetto to the partisans. Most importantly, it enabled thousands of ghetto Jews to flee to the surrounding forests, where they joined partisan units fighting the Germans. In stark contrast to what transpired across most of Eastern Europe, where Jews found few reliable allies in the face of the Nazi threat, and unlike the better-known resistance movement in places like Warsaw, Vilna, and Kovno, Kaunas, the movement in the Minsk ghetto was able to rely on the collaboration with those outside of the ghetto, especially Belarusians outside of the ghetto. Thousands of Jews managed to escape from the ghetto into the forest, where they founded 7 partisan brigades, one of which, in September 1943, organized the assassination of General Governor of Belarusia, the German Wilhelm Kube. Altogether, about 10,000 Minsk Jews succeeded in escaping from the Minsk ghetto, a proportion that is without parallel in the history of the Holocaust. The internationalist ethos fostered by 2 decades of Soviet rule might have played a role, but it was also the nature of Belarusians, I think, that made this possible. In 1945, the first memorial to, I'm just showing you again other images from the Minsk ghetto, and I can go back to this. These are the synagogues that were destroyed, some of the synagogues that I discussed earlier. This is some of the remains of the Minsk cemetery that were destroyed and was located on the site of the ghetto. And here you have the first memorial to the Jewish victims in Minsk, held in 1945 at the site of the Yama, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where 5,000 Jews in the ghetto were killed. And here you have some participants in this first memorial of 1945. As far as the post-war period goes, there was a flip side to the coin of this international ethos that I just mentioned. If the success of the Bolshevik idea of brotherhood of peoples in Belarusia saved the lives of thousands of Jews during the Holocaust, after the war, it led to, this adherence to the party line, which, with regard to the Jewish question, meant anti-Semitism, disguised as anti-cosmopolitanism and anti-Zionism. As part of the state-sponsored anti-Semitic and anti-cosmopolitan campaign of the 1940s and early 1950s, on Stalin's orders, the chairman of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and the director of the Moscow Yiddish Theater, Solomon Michoez, was murdered in Minsk on January 13, 1948. The Belarusian State Yiddish Theater was closed down in 1949, and many Minsk Jews were accused of being enemies of the Soviet Union. They were dismissed from their jobs and arrested. Whether it was a consequence of state anti-Semitism or not, the city Jewish cemeteries were destroyed to make way for the creation of new Soviet buildings. Upon his release from the Gulag, Mendel Marshak, who in pre-war period had been a prominent figure in the Belarusian meat industry, returned to Minsk. Together with a group of local Jews, he petitioned the city Soviet, asking permission to put up a fence around the Jewish cemetery on Kalvarskaya Street. This would prevent animals from grazing on the territory of the cemetery. And he wrote, "How can it be great revolutionary Jews who gave their lives for the revolution are buried here, including our parents. But the petition was unsuccessful. One of the memorials erected in Minsk after the war was the monument to Belarusian writer Jakub Kolos, and you see it here. The memorial was made in part with the tombstones from a Jewish cemetery. And in spite of the efforts to erase them completely, the Hebrew letters were still clearly visible. In 1959, the main synagogue in use in Minsk was closed down, and in the late 1960s, the last Jewish cemetery was destroyed to make room for a football stadium, according to the Soviet tradition of the 1960s and 70s. I would like to conclude this journey today with an anecdote and recount two experiences I had in Minsk that occurred at the time of two different visits there in 2003, that I mentioned in the beginning, and 2008. Both capture the continuity of the Soviet legacy in the city today. The first, while I was living in Minsk in 2003, I visited the Museum of World War II. In the section of the exhibit about the heroic partisan war against the German invader, I saw the famous image of the 17-year-old Masha Bruskina. It was on display. This image, more than any other, became the symbol of the local partisan struggle against the enemy. In spite of the widely accepted notion that Masha Bruskina was Jewish, to my great surprise, the museum failed, and at least I haven't been back to Minsk since 2009, but up until 2009, it failed to point that out. In the Soviet spirit of suppressing the Jewish identity of both victims and heroes of World War II, the caption under the image read, "Unknown partisan." A few years later, in 2008, I spent a semester in Vilna, in Vilnius, which, in spite of its status of cultural capital of Europe at the time, had some anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism was palpable at the time, even though not everywhere, of course, but there was some anti-Semitism. So I traveled to Minsk with my family, and we decided to visit the synagogue. I was looking for the synagogue. It was the Sabbath. And for some reason, I didn't feel comfortable to ask openly, where is the synagogue? So I just asked, where is Ulica Dauman? Where is Dauman Street, where the synagogue was located? And I was so happy when the woman I asked, she very jovially, very, nonchalantly, she answered, and she said, "Oh, are you looking for the synagogue? Of course, it's over there. Just turn right and then left, and you will find the synagogue." So I found that there was much less anti-Semitism at the time in Minsk in 2008 than I had expected. So that's it from me. I hope that this was interesting. I hope I didn't speak for too long. And that's it. That's all I have to say. About our journey through the city.